Without further ado, I'll introduce Professor Lemmens. Professor Lemmens is professor at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law, with several cross appointments at the medical school at the Joint Centre for Bioethics. He holds the Scholl Chair in Health Law and Policy and has been doing work that spans various areas, of course, health law, ethics, as well as looking at science policy and serving on various boards and ethical committees. After Professor Lemmens gives his lecture, we're also very fortunate to have a commentary by Professor Amir Adaran, who probably here needs no introduction. He's a professor of law as well as in the Faculty of Medicine here at the University of Ottawa. And then there'll be a Q&A period, so everyone should definitely get their questions ready. As a final note, I just want to acknowledge that the Technology Law Speakers Series is sponsored by Tories, so thank you. And it's really, on a personal level, it's quite amazing, I think, to be hosting Professor Lemmens. When I was a JD student at the University of Toronto, I was Professor Lemmens' student, and I can say from personal experience, he was a fantastic teacher and mentor for me. So it's great to have you here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, the other colleagues of the University of Ottawa. It's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces, either people I knew already from Toronto, but from the health law, law and technology community in general. So it's really a pleasure to be here, to be able to speak to you today. Je voudrais simplement dire quelque chose brièvement pour les francophones. Ma présentation sera en anglais. Les diapositives aussi sont en anglais, mais on a fait des traductions, surtout le Centre de droit de la santé a fait des traductions. La plupart des diapositives, j'ai changé moi-même certaines choses. Il peut y avoir un ou deux diapositives qui ne sont pas complètement traduites, mais pour ceux qui sont intéressés à voir les traductions, je vais distribuer, il y a 10 copies ou quelque chose comme ça. Et vous pouvez suivre avec la présentation, la traduction ici sur... alors je vais vous passer ça. Alors si vous pouvez passer ça, OK. Alors aussi, si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas à les poser pendant ma présentation. Après la présentation, ça me ferait un plaisir de répondre aussi en français. But so I'll start with my presentation in English. The title of my presentation is How Pharmaceutical Regulation Facilitated Knowledge Control and Fraud, Whether It Can Still Save Us. It's really quite a complicated story that I will try to tell in 40 to 50 minutes. So I will only be able to give you some snapshots of some of the ideas that I developed in some papers, also with some other colleagues. So at the end of my presentation, you'll see a slide with some further information. So I encourage you to read that or to contact me if I can help with sending you the papers or giving some further explanation. So the basic argument is that drug regulation, as it historically has grown, particularly since the 1900s, but starting particularly after the thalidomide disaster, has actually contributed to a monopoly power over the creation of scientific knowledge in the hands of industry. And this knowledge control, in my view, impacts not only on the drug regulatory system itself, but also on the various legal tools that we have at our disposal, including legal action, including tort law. So it impacts on the way these tools actually help us to promote public health. So that's the basic story. I will not be able to develop in detail all of the legal regulatory changes that I think are needed to basically change the paradigm of drug regulation that we have now. But I will focus on one tool, which is the tool of transparency, which is a tool that has been increasingly emphasized, which has also been introduced recently in Canada, at least on paper with Vanessa's law, but where some recent applications of the new transparency provisions in Vanessa's law actually show us that Canada really still has a long way to go. So that's basically the story, but let me fill in now some of the details of the story in my presentation. So thalidomide is familiar to most of you. It was a disaster in the context of drug development, where we had a a pharmaceutical product distributed to women in their pregnancy for dealing with morning sickness, and were around the world, many children were actually affected with very serious birth deformations as a result of their mother taking the drug. It's a story of the disaster in many countries of drug regulation, but it's also a story of the success of drug regulation arguably in the United States. So in the United States, you had one young drug regulator, woman, Frances Kelsey, who was actually Canadian from Victoria, who was working in the drug regulatory system, and who stopped the distribution, or the sale at least, the commercial sale of thalidomide in the United States by single-handedly continuing to ask questions to the company which wanted to distribute the pharmaceutical product in the United States. But the drug regulatory system that we had at that time was actually still quite weak. It focused only on safety, so it didn't have any requirement that you actually had to show in detail that the drug worked. Some commentators have shown that in reality the drug regulator was already sometimes looking at some efficacy issues simply as part of the safety assessment. But overall, you basically simply had to show with some data that a clinical product, a pharmaceutical product, was safe to enter it into the market. The drug regulatory system was actually so weak, even in the United States at that time, that you could conduct clinical trials without any need for approval or any need for providing preliminary evidence of safety. You didn't have to ask for permission from the drug regulator to distribute a pharmaceutical product in the context of clinical trials. So in the States, the product thalidomide was actually distributed to physicians as part of clinical trials. But overall, what was interesting from the thalidomide story is that it showed that drug regulation is important. So even though thalidomide was not an issue of efficacy, the drug was actually quite effective in dealing with morning sickness. It was clearly an issue of safety. So even from a safety perspective, which we already had as a regulatory requirement, we could say that the system to some extent worked in the United States, but it also created a shift in public thinking and in public support for drug regulation as a whole. So following thalidomide, new changes were introduced in the drug regulatory system in the United States, and clearly also in many other countries. The Kefauver-Harris amendments in 1962 were the first regulatory requirements that actually focused not only on efficacy, not only on safety, but also on efficacy. For the first time, pharmaceutical companies had actually to show that their drug did something, was working for the purpose for which they wanted to have it approved. Simply as a result of the fact that the public and parliamentary members, Congress members in the United States started to accept the idea that drug regulation and control by regulators was important. What that can do, drug regulation, is actually shown by the review that the FDA undertook of all of the drugs that were at that time on the market. So in 1965, it did a review of 3,000. It finished in 1965, but it started actually immediately after the Kefauver-Harris amendments. They did a review of 3,442 pharmaceutical products and came to the conclusion that 2,000 products had to be withdrawn from the market because of efficacy issues. So you had products on the market, pharmaceutical products, which nearly always have side effects. Otherwise, they wouldn't actually do anything if there wouldn't be any side effects to these products. So 2,000 products were withdrawn from the market. I often cited that in the past actually as an example why drug regulation worked and why the claim that some people have, for example, a drug specialist of the Fraser Institute still goes around saying that the market can actually solve all of the problems with pharmaceutical products. Well, if you see that there were 2,000 products withdrawn from the market after an efficacy review, it suggests that regulation is important, that market forces actually don't screen out products that don't work. So I think it speaks for itself that drug regulation is important. At the same time, some recent commentators have started to point out that even this drug review drug efficacy study raises more complex issues than I presented it right now, namely showing that inefficacious products were on the market and had to be withdrawn. The evidence that started to become required as a result of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment was actually focusing increasingly since 1962 on evidence obtained in randomized clinical trials. So more and more the drug regulator was actually insisting that you had to conduct clinical trials and that these clinical trials had to show both safety and efficacy requirements. So some commentators have actually said that the insistence on clinical trials evidence may actually have led to a withdrawal of product that if you kind of would have looked at more long-term and more complex evidence that some of these products actually may have been better than was thought in 1965. But can't discuss this in detail here, but since 1962, 1965, and the decades following, you clearly see worldwide the development of increasingly detailed drug regulatory requirements, but always or largely based on a review of clinical trials data that had to be submitted by drug regulatory companies, by pharmaceutical companies to the regulator. And these data were reviewed by the drug regulator and led to a rejection or an approval of a pharmaceutical product. They focused, all of these regulatory requirements focused largely on market entry. And it's an important point that you have to keep in mind, because it means that once the drugs were on the market, regulatory control basically largely stopped. I'm overemphasizing it here. In the last couple of years, we certainly have a growing emphasis on the need for a market for drug regulatory control once pharmaceutical products are in the market. But it's fair to say that even now, today, the emphasis is largely on market entry. You submit your clinical trials data, you get your product on the market, and then the product can be sold in a context in which a lot of liberty allows actually for potential abuse. You have, for example, the possibility of promoting indirectly off-label prescription, and so on and so on. So I'll give you some examples of that, but again, I have to be reasonably brief to come to the discussion about transparency as a regulatory means to change a little bit this particular paradigm. So what was the result of the growing regulatory system, the growing regulatory requirements in the period post-thalidomide up to now? So the system that we've developed is characterized, and if you have questions about that, I can say something more about that in detail, but I have to summarize basically what I see as the characteristics of the drug regulatory system now. It's a system with an extraordinary reliance on data produced and submitted by industry, primarily at market entry. Yes, there is regulatory review, in some countries in more detail than others, but again, it's primarily the pharmaceutical companies that have to produce the clinical trials data. It's also a system that led, interestingly, to a whole new industry, an industry that works directly for the pharmaceutical companies, and that is focusing on the production of data, which is an interesting phenomenon if you think about it. So it's an industry that purely developed as a result of drug regulatory requirements. It's now estimated as a $5 billion industry, where you have contract research organizations focusing on running clinical trials. You have commercial research ethics committees who actually review clinical trials as part of the drug regulatory system, working for pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations. You have communications agencies who work for the pharmaceutical companies, who with the CROs basically work on the production of analysis of clinical trials data and publications in the scientific literature. And you have increasingly an integration of academic science, investigators, and academic literature as well, in an industry-controlled production of science. So what is also a complicated story is, for example, that certainly since the 80s, clinical trials have significantly moved out of academia. So before, it used to be the case that academic investigators were more involved in conducting the clinical trials. There was not such a direct relation between data production companies and industry, and you had more academics involved in some way in the production of clinical trials data and analysis of the results. But the clinical trials, the conduct of clinical trials itself has actually significantly shifted. So a large majority of trials, up to 80–90% of clinical trials, are now conducted outside of academic centers. And academic investigators are now actually more and more simply functioning as scientists who give credibility to studies that have been conducted elsewhere. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, but sometimes you have to put things starkly as they are, a little bit starker than they are, and we will, I'll show you actually some problems. So what are the problems that result from this particular change in the paradigm of the conduct of clinical trials and the conduct of the creation of scientific evidence? You have a control of the industry over the production, the distribution, and the use of data. And the use of data, I mean thereby drug prescription practices. So industry produces the data, analyzes the results, works with specialized communications agency to get the articles published, also in the scientific literature. Scientific literature is thus shaped by the people who have actually an interest in selling the drugs. They influence, for example, clinical practice guidelines, which inform physicians about how to prescribe pharmaceutical products. There are various problems with that. So again, I can't discuss all of the evidence that exists there, but in the scientific literature, in the medical literature, many meta-analyses are published about the relation, for example, between funders of research and outcome of research, about clinical trial design influenced by the financial interest at stake, and so on. So to summarize it, well, we see problems with skewed clinical trial design. We see an incredible amount of evidence about the hiding and misrepresentation of clinical trials data, which we have to call what it is. It's basically fraudulent misrepresentation in many cases, certainly not just bias in the context of research. We see manipulation of scientific literature in practices of off-label prescription. And we see an aggressive promotion of off-label prescription, which often straddles legality, and which actually has led to quite a lot of prosecutions in the United States. And I would say you have limited control of the regulatory agencies. So some people may challenge me on that, but I actually think overall it's surprising that certainly with respect to the scientific production and the manipulation of science, the drug regulatory agencies are actually not doing so much. So the products are approved on the basis of relatively limited evidence, with, I would say, little control on the distribution of knowledge and drug safety after approval. And I'll give you some examples now. These are just snapshots. You can say I selected them. Obviously I selected them, but there is actually, I have a tendency to enter into these stories with too many examples. So if I will be running out of time, it's because there are too many examples actually which are quite interesting. A little bit rhetoric is to refer here to what the industry itself says about the nature of scientific evidence. This is a manual which I found many years ago, probably already 10 years ago, called Scientific Publication Strategy, Managing Reputation, Clinical Trial Results, and Commercial Relevance, Best Practices LLP. So I found it on the internet. I didn't buy it. It was a little bit too expensive for my purse, $3,695. I don't think CIHR or Shirk would have found it reasonable for me to buy this manual. So it's a manual of the scientific publications industry working for the pharmaceutical companies. What do they say about scientific data? Well, they say picking and choosing favorable findings may have been acceptable a decade ago. I never thought it was acceptable, but you see that basically in the industry there is, on the internet, you easily find a quote like this saying, well, you know, we did this. We were involved in picking favorable findings, but it's now considered unethical and potentially illegal. But then also scientific publications are an essential tool for both clinical and commercial purposes. They are intended to influence the target audience. So you see here already basically a blunt statement in the publication industry about science is a commercial product. Which in and of itself not bad, but obviously if you kind of connect it to the first, it's a problem. Now, what kind of practices have been exposed in the literature? I already mentioned there's a vast amount of evidence available, both in the literature, in books, in manuscripts that actually detail in quite some detail problems with the pharmaceutical industry and the interactions between pharmaceutical industry and the physicians. I just put some titles here of influential books by former editors of the New England Journal of Medicine. So these are not just sensationalist writers. These are people who work in the medical profession who actually have been troubled by what has been going on and how it actually shapes and influences medical practice. So there's quite a lot of evidence that they discuss in these books. You can read some of these. There's a vast literature, which is, I would say, actually a hopeful sign about how the profession is looking at this and trying to change the way we deal with scientific evidence. So you see in the medical literature a large number of studies actually that highlight some of the things that are documented also in these books. So let me give you simply some examples that give you a sense of how systemic the problem really is. So one interesting example is this one. So this is a publication by Turner and others in the New England Journal of Medicine, where this research group actually looked at the data submitted to the Food and Drug Administration with respect to the new antidepressants that were submitted in a particular period of time to the Food and Drug Administration. So they found 74 FDA-registered studies. When they looked at the data that the FDA received, they came to the conclusion that of these studies, only 51 were positive. So in other words, you have a large number of antidepressants approved with at least, good to know that it's questionable data, 51 positive, 41 negative, meaning they raised safety or efficacy issues. But what's more problematic is when they looked at the published literature, they came to the conclusion that 94% of the literature was positive about the studies supporting the new antidepressants. And what's troubling of that is that 22 studies were not published, but even more troubling that 11 studies, which they found in the 74 FDA-registered studies, that 11 were negative but were published conveying a positive outcome. So you see here concrete evidence. The FDA receives certain data. The published literature says a completely different story. What do the physicians read? They don't go to the FDA files. Even these researchers had difficulty getting a good grasp of what the studies were saying. But you see here that what we rely on in medical practice, or what physicians rely on in medical practice, is misrepresenting what the Drug Regulatory Agency itself has. So if I talk about limited control, I would say, how is that possible? How is it possible that we have a drug regulatory system, that we have scientific publications influencing prescription practices, but that the drug regulator doesn't go out there and say, well, there is actually a problem here with the scientific literature. There is misrepresentation. There are serious problems with the information that doctors and the public receive. There are many other examples. There's so again, it shows you that the medical profession or medical researchers are at least interested and even have some humor in the way they design studies. So this is another story. I won't discuss it in detail, but the title says it in and of itself. So published in the influential journal, the American Journal of Psychiatry, these researchers looked at 30 reports of comparative efficacy of clinical trials funded by industry on antipsychotics, and they came to the conclusion, if you look at all of these studies, every drug beats the other drug. So olanzapine beats risperidone, risperidone beats creatine, and creatine beats olanzapine. So showing simply that depending on who funds the study, you get an interesting outcome. I'll give you a last example before I move to some of the discussions about regulation and transparency, because it's an example that I will come back to when we deal with the issue of transparency, what transparency can do. Here you have an example of a study that was undertaken in on the efficacy of Seroxat Paxil for the treatment of depression in children and adolescents. Now, the important thing you have to know, this was a drug that was already on the market. It was approved for the treatment of depression in adults. And the company producing the drug was actually interested in running clinical trials to be able to obtain a label change. In other words, to be able to have the drug approved for the treatment of depression in children and adolescents, because it then allows also in the United States at least to actually more aggressively market the drug, to do direct consumer advertising, which is not, at least in theory, not allowed in the Canadian context. And so what did they do? They conducted a couple of clinical trials, and here you see a confidential document that became available actually as a result of lawsuits in the United States, in which the researchers themselves, and basically the company has these documents, come to the conclusion that the data of these studies are insufficiently robust to support a label change. In other words, the data is not interesting. The clinical trial study 329 raised actually safety and efficacy issues. So there were concerns actually that it had a negative impact on the health and well-being of individual patients, children and adolescents. You have to know that this drug was already widely prescribed off-label. So it's not that physicians couldn't prescribe it. They were actually prescribing it off-label already at a very significant rate, which was perfectly legal. So you and I will certainly agree that if you think about public health related concerns, that it's completely unacceptable to conduct clinical trials, to find that there are problems with the safety and efficacy of the studies, and then to basically hide the data. Decide, as a company, we will not publicize these data, knowing very well that people will continue to prescribe the drugs off-label. Having more information on what these trials were in relation to what kind of drug, they could actually trace it back only 100 of these findings of problems to identifiable studies. In other words, they could find back that the particular studies to which the problems related. They also found out that 78 scientific publications based on the studies with significant FDA-identified problems, including fraud, existed in the scientific literature, and that only 3 of these papers actually refer to problems in the clinical trial. What's even more problematic is FDA advisory committee members, who are quite influential in sending the message about what drugs should be approved or not, were not informed of the fact that there were problems with the clinical trials. So even when the FDA does dig deeper, it doesn't actually use the information as it should be. Okay, this is, I think, is a major factor that determines why we have problems with the drug regulatory system. It's not the only problem that we have. The way in which drugs are being prescribed is also influenced by various power relations in between industry, regulators, medical professions, the regulator, political decision makers. There are socio-cultural factors. There are problems in the academic incentive structure. So why do academics participate in some of these things? Well, it's because they get an extra publication. Sometimes and actually quite often they get paid, but I actually think that the academic incentive structure is more of a reason why they sometimes participate. Industry-sponsored studies get actually published in better academic journals, or often dealing with big studies that actually do draw a lot of attention. So there are many, many other factors. But a very important factor is actually also the way in which the system of the construction of scientific knowledge is hooked into the evidence-based medicine paradigm that we all warmly embrace, we think is a good thing. But if you think about what it means, it basically means that we will emphasize the importance of clinical trials data, but the clinical trials data themselves are the problem. Okay. So is this a public health problem? I actually can go over that quite quickly. There are many studies that show that the adverse effects of medication are a huge public health problem. Do cause an enormous amount of deaths. Again, it's not just the misrepresentation by industry, it's not just the manipulation of science that causes this. It's also that we're dealing with an more elderly population, that people may be confused, that people do believe too easily that the drug will save them, and so on. So there are many other factors, but the manipulation of science and the misrepresentation of science and the very aggressive promotion of prescription is certainly an important factor. That shows, for example, that drug deaths now outnumber traffic fatalities in the United States. So drug deaths meaning deaths as a result of people taking pharmaceutical products. And obviously it has huge implications even for the cost of healthcare, not only for the money we spend on drugs, but also for the fact that we have to treat people who suffer from side effects, that we do invest, take for example public health decisions about stockpiling of Tamiflu, which are based on flawed or insufficient scientific evidence, which costs us millions, if not billions sometimes of dollars. Are there interventions? Yes, there are interventions. In the United States, we've seen regulatory action that has resulted in a massive amount of penalties on pharmaceutical companies for particular practices that violated the Food and Drug Acts and regulations. So I have a slide here from Bloomberg Markets, which should not be seen as a suspicious socialist or anti-industry venue. So it's actually a business focused journal publication which reported, which has a special report on Big Pharma's crime spree in a couple of years ago, and documented how all of the major pharmaceutical companies basically have been penalized up to $2.3 billion. It's actually the latest penalty for GlaxoSmithKline was $7.9 billion. So astonishing amounts of money for practices that are repeated over and over again. Actually, if you look at the level of the penalties, they've significantly increased. So they started at, say, 100 million, 200 million, 400 million. They now are at 7.9 billion for practices that are quite similar over time. One of the messages that this sends is basically that the money involved and the profits generated by prescription of patented products within a given period of time is so massive that even very excessive penalties of 2.5 billion are not a sufficient deterrent to actually completely change the practice. So that's the only message I want to say with respect to the interventions in the context of the pharmaceutical companies. So let me move now to what are some of the other mechanisms that we may have. A wide variety of regulatory tools can be employed in this particular context. You think about tort law. So again, quite a lot of regulatory tools, quite a lot of interesting data, for example, have become available as a result of tort law actions in the United States, class action lawsuit against pharmaceutical companies. We have in the United States at least, although I have never seen it in the Canadian context, the application of the criminal law, which I think should be improved. There is no reason why some of the practice that we've seen in the United States should not be significantly prosecuted in Canada as well. We see professional regulations that could be employed. We have academic sanctions that can be employed. But one of the key challenges that we see in this context is that the evidentiary basis, particularly of tort law, for example, is affected by the fact that we have this manipulation and control of scientific production. So it becomes very hard in the court system to challenge a pharmaceutical company if the witnesses, the expert witnesses you want to invoke actually are generally working for pharmaceutical companies or have been involved with publications which sometimes and often actually misrepresent the science. So the evidentiary basis of interventions at these different levels becomes more difficult because of the very control of industry over the knowledge basis. Interesting recommendations have been made, which I can't discuss, that we actually have to completely change the way clinical evidence is being created through a new independent drug testing system. I think over time this is the most reasonable option. It won't happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, what can we do? In the meantime, transparency has been embraced as certainly a new way of dealing with clinical trials data. So I already mentioned to you the Paxil story of a company conducting clinical trials, sitting on the data and not releasing them. That was actually one of the cases that created an impetus of international organizations like the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, regulatory agencies around the world to start requiring registration of clinical trials so that pharmaceutical companies could not just do a clinical trial and then hide the data, and also results reporting. So significant measures and significant recommendations have been issued by international organizations, have been integrated in drug regulations or guidelines in various countries, including Canada. So what does this transparency do? Let me say something more about that. But let me first show how the Canadian interpretation of transparency is quite problematic. So Canada, under pressure of various agencies, and actually following the initiative of parliamentary members, including Terence Young, who's an MP from Oakville, adopted Vanessa's Law, which was named after his daughter, who died actually as a result of the prescription of a pharmaceutical product. Vanessa's Law introduced also a transparency requirement. So Vanessa's Law's new section 21(1) indicates that a minister may disclose confidential business information about the therapeutic product without notification if the purpose of the disclosure is related to the protection of or promotion of human health or safety of the public. And so disclosure is possible to governmental agencies, advisors, or researchers who are conducting research on public health. The former disclosure in the Canadian context was actually under the Access to Information Act and was not so significantly different. As the Vanessa's Law, which basically classifies clinical trials data as confidential business information, the previous Access to Information Act also had as a presumption data is confidential except if. So I'll say something more about that in a minute because it can be different. You can actually take the presumption this data is public unless there are some strong reasons why the data should not be disclosed, which is actually increasing with the European approach. So how has Canada employed this transparency system? 2 weeks ago, we've seen a CBC report come out where Nav Persaud of the University of Toronto asked access to data about, interestingly, not thalidomide, and certainly there's no indication that it's actually as harmful as thalidomide, but a morning sickness drug, which is widely sold in Canada. It's not readily available actually in most other countries, but is widely sold in Canada. It's promoted by a Quebec company, which has received the support also of the Mother Risk program at the University of Toronto, which is a program that promotes information to pregnant women and has been funded actually by the company producing the drug. So Nav Persaud has done research on this particular drug, came to the conclusion on the basis of the publicly available data that the drug actually didn't seem to be so good as the organization Mother Risk presented it, and he requested access to data held by Health Canada to complete his analysis. So we have a lot of data that Health Canada has that he didn't have access to. What did Health Canada say? Well, they actually, for the first time under Vanessa's Law, asked him to sign a confidentiality agreement, meaning he can't share the data with anybody in his research team. So the statistician next to him would not be able to see the data. He has to destroy the data at the end of his research. And so in the context of scientific exchange, when he submits his publication for his analysis for publication, he first has to notify Health Canada, which has which can actually look at it and make sure that he has used the data only for the purpose that he said he would use it for, and he also can't share the data with the scientific journal, which doesn't make sense because increasingly you see the most credible scientific journals actually say, we have to see the data. You have to be willing to share the data that we can verify that your analysis is appropriate. So Health Canada's approach to transparency, I would say, is creating confidentiality walls. I would say the opposite of what transparency is all about. Can it be done differently? I have to move a little bit quickly over that. I actually will cut some parts of my presentation. We have until 1, so with questions included. Yeah, but anyway, so I'll quickly explain to you the European Medicines Agency system. I won't be able to discuss some of the controversies around it, but to show you that it can be done differently and what the results of significant disclosure can be. So the European Medicines Agency has been put under pressure of the European Ombudsman. So it's interesting, regulatory agencies don't seem to do that in enough itself. They have to have pressure by advocacy groups, or in the European context by the European Ombudsman. So they used to have the same approach as Health Canada, secrecy as a rule, disclosure as an exception. They changed it completely in its first change in policy in 2011, and they released in a very quick period of time more than 1.9 million pages of clinical trials data that was previously hidden. Okay? And they even introduced now a prospective policy where they say this clinical trials data will in principle be shared. So some things may be kept confidential in discussions with the company, but as a matter of principle, this is publicly accessible data. So what has happened as a result? The 1.9 million pages of clinical trials data and data available actually as a result of lawsuits in the United States has already spurred the, I would say, civil society and independent scientists to change the way we conduct science in the context of pharmaceutical clinical trials. So this is an initiative published in the British Medical Journal 2 years ago, where the researchers, this research group, basically announced that they would start conducting or basically mandating independent analysis of publicly available data to check whether the published literature is in line with the newly available, publicly available data on many of these particular drugs. So they have a list of drugs there where they, after an initial review, noticed that there seemed to be some discrepancies where further analysis is needed. And so they called upon the pharmaceutical companies and the original academic scientists who published with help of the, in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies, certain studies. So they invited pharmaceutical companies and the original authors of potentially misleading studies to correct the literature based on the now publicly available data. What happened? One of the first studies, or the first study to be published that uses the newly available clinical trials data, actually restores, corrects the literature on the Paxil study 329. And the study came to the conclusion that paroxetine is actually has problems of safety and efficacy in the treatment of children and adolescents. So you see here scientists in civil society, scientific journals working together to use now newly publicly available data to correct the scientific literature and basically change the way science is being reported. I can't discuss in detail here how industry is pushing back. There is aggressive case law actually, or there has been aggressive lawsuits in the context of Europe to try to restrict the data access policy, which has actually led also to a change in the way the European Medicines Agency was going to release its data under its new policy. I can't discuss that in detail. In other publications, I've actually started arguing that it's important to look at data access from a human rights perspective. So if I have 3 minutes to briefly explain that, why is it important? Because in the context of lawsuits against the European Medicines Agency by pharmaceutical companies have actually started to develop human rights related claims. First of all, to argue that clinical trials, the release of clinical trials data and clinical reports may violate the privacy rights of individual research participants and actually may violate the right to privacy of the companies themselves. So you may think this is a ludicrous argument. So basically, the claim by industry is the data that we have is actually data over which we have a right to privacy. It's complicated to explain it in detail, but the right to privacy under the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Charter is actually wider than the kind of privacy concept that we generally embrace. And so in first instance, pharmaceutical companies have actually been successful in court to make that claim, that the data, the clinical trials data that they've produced was protected by some level of the right to privacy. So in other words, was part of their human right to secrecy. So I've argued actually before that these claims were made by industry that exactly the opposite is true. And so in some of the papers that you can consult, I've gone through some of the case law, which makes an interesting connection between right to information, the right to health, the right to information, freedom of expression, and accountable government. So there are many complex interrelations between access to information, the role of civil society in promoting public accountability, the role of civil society and individuals to obtaining access actually to information that relates to their particular health. And so there are a couple of interesting cases that you can look at. I'll simply mention one interesting one, the Guerra case, which deals with the government's failure to provide information about a safety risk, level of risk associated with people living in a particular village close to a chemical plant. So the government had certain types of information, didn't disclose it to individuals, and basically the European Court of Human Rights argued that the government failed in its duty to protect or to promote the privacy right of individuals who needed to have access to that particular information. I even argue there that we can, under human rights, construct a state obligation to produce information. In other words, that the state, if it wants to protect, for example, the human rights of individuals to health and to healthcare decision making, that it has to be involved in the production of scientific information. There is a growing movement in that direction. You see some international conventions that already contain some component of access to information, but not just access to information, also the duty of states to produce information to help individuals to make health policy decisions. So simply to conclude, if I had gone through the details of the human rights analysis, it was important to emphasize here that a human rights analysis helps to create an interpretive shield against arguments pro-secrecy of data, which are increasingly made in the international context. It recognizes the obligation of states to implement reliable systems of knowledge production, and I think it's important to kind of see how civil society can play an important role in that context. So I'll keep it at that, and if you have any questions for clarification, I'm happy to do so. Okay.
Great job. I won't even think about using slides. My role is to react to this in 5 or 10 minutes, something like that. So let me make it quick. I agree with pretty well everything you've said. But let's be clear. Most of the examples of clinical trials being buried and not published and containing valuable information, two things are true. One, they're pretty old, right? And so over 10 years old, 15 years old. And two, they're mainly in the psychiatry field, mental health, things like that, right? I mean, antidepressants are one example. Whoa, I'll forget it. Who needs that? You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, all right. It does make a terrible racket. Now, there's reasons for that. One is that psychopharmacology itself is a pretty weak science. This is not a field in which you have excellent biochemical markers for what makes a person depressed or schizophrenic or what have you. So developing any therapy in that space always is going to be about as bad of science as you get in the pharmaceutical field. Second of all, what's changed, thankfully, is not just the European transparency initiatives you mentioned, but also the medical journals decided that they would not publish clinical trials unless the trials were registered. And that was a non-legal solution by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which I think was very useful. And I was at the time on the editorial board of the CMAJ and also the Lancet, and we were amazed to see how all of a sudden certain trials that you'd get submitted stopped being submitted because it was just clear that the authors couldn't register and defend the trial publicly. So that really made a big difference and was a non-legal solution. Clinicaltrials.gov, websites that set up information on ongoing clinical trials has also helped that way. Now, one thing, Trudo, that I want to mention is most of your research and your presentation has been on pre-market issues, clinical trials to get a product in the market. And I want to complement what you said by saying many of the same problems exist in a post-market context. So what does that mean? Once a drug is approved and on the market, regulation doesn't end. The regulator wants to inspect the factories and make sure that the factories live up to good manufacturing practice. The regulator wants to do what's called pharmacovigilance and make sure that the product, once on the market, once being taken by patients, does what it's supposed to do and is safe. And that's a different kind of regulatory science, post-market rather than pre-market. And I would say, if anything right now, the post-market space is more problematic than the pre-market because there's been so much progress, as you point out, made in the pre-market area. Let me tell you about some post-market nightmare stories. So one good example is what's happened with the offshoring of clinical trials. We are now finding that a lot of those were fraudulent. There's the case of GVK Pharma. This is an Indian company. A lot of clinical trials have moved to India. It's cheaper. GVK Pharma was recently busted by the European regulator for having faked the data on electrocardiograms used to get medicines onto the market. They just faked the data. Now, these are the tests that demonstrate whether a medicine will, damage your heart or not. So this is not slightly important. As a result, the Europeans withdrew 700 medicines from their market like that earlier this year because this Indian company faked the data for all sorts of products. Now, what has Canada done? Nothing. What has the US done? Nothing. All those medicines are on the North American market. And you can imagine that something more needs to be done, although we don't really know what, because we don't have any way, lack of transparency, of knowing which medicines on the Canadian market are affected by GVK's fraudulent results. The names of the medicines are redacted. But without much doubt, there are markets in North America selling medicines that the Europeans have banned, and we probably would ban if we knew what they were. Another point to be made is in the post-market space, prosecution has been helpful where it's been done well. A very good colleague of mine, Dr. Dinesh Thakur, wonderful man, used to be a vice president at an Indian company called Ranbaxy, a generics company. He discovered while he was a senior executive there that Ranbaxy had faked stability data on its products. He blew the whistle on this using the US whistleblower law. Pity Canada doesn't have such a good law that way. But the end of that story was Ranbaxy pleaded guilty to defrauding the US government and selling adulterated medicines in the US market, paid $500 million, $500 million in civil and criminal penalties. And Dinesh, as the whistleblower, got a share of that. He walked out with about $40 million. So now he's a well-funded guy who loves causing trouble for pharma companies. We would like to see something, I think, like that in Canada. But our prosecution authorities are, let's just be honest, lame compared to the U.S. in that regard. And by the way, this offshoring thing and data manipulation thing is a current issue with even Canadian companies. In the last year or so, Apotex, a Canadian generics company, has been reproached by the United States, by the Food and Drug Administration, for not maintaining, quote, good manufacturing practices in certain Indian facilities. Because of that, our Minister of Health here, until recently, Rona Ambrose, imposed an import ban on Apotex's products from those factories, with the exception of only a few. Apotex sued the minister in a terrible, wrong federal court decision about a week ago. Apotex won and got the court to order that the import ban be lifted and the minister retract her comments. Just to show you how aggressive these companies can be, I was asked by the Toronto Star what I thought about that court decision, and I said, well, I think the court got it wrong. And I think, you know, when the FDA has said that there are good manufacturing practice issues with Apotex, that's an issue. Within 2 hours, I got a letter from Apotex's lawyers asking me to withdraw that because it was defamatory. I'll be talking about that at the National Health Law Conference next month, the Apotex libel chill. You remember Dr. Nancy Oliveri? I guess my middle name's Oliveri or something. I don't know. But they're going down that road again. And you know, that just shows you how aggressive these companies can be. But my point being, all of these examples are in the post-market space, mainly generics companies now, because the situation with the brand name companies and pre-market, so much has changed in the last 10 years that it's improving, and now it's the post-market space that's really more troublesome, I think. The last point on freedom of information, access to information, you couldn't be more right. The system sucks. I mean, in almost every country. One thing that, you know, in our research, we filed hundreds of freedom of information, access to information requests in Canada, the US, and lately India. And I'm finding of the three countries, the fastest to respond to those requests is India. And the slowest is Canada. Our access to information system is worse than a third world country. I mean, I have access to information requests that are years old that have not been answered on drug and pharmaceutical issues. But in India, I get them answered often within weeks. And now the way that the Health Canada has manipulated Vanessa's law around Nav-Persaud's disclosures with diclectin, to me, I don't see a choice. I think that has to be judicially reviewed, because the idea that you would have Parliament passing a law saying Health Canada may disclose information, and then Health Canada only discloses it if you sign a confidentiality agreement. Confidential disclosure is not disclosure. That is not what Parliament meant. And that just needs to go to judicial review. You know, time to sue the tired old minister again, I guess. Anyway, the point being, these are really serious issues. I compliment everything you've done on it. I would say the post-market space deserves the Trudo Lemmens treatment now, because that's under-researched.
In the remaining 15 minutes, I'd like to invite questions, comments from the audience. Yeah. And speak up, because it's a little bit harder to hear this way.
Okay, I'll continue, Professor Ratter.
Wait just 1 second.
Pharmacovigilance. Microphone is always better. So first of all, thank you, Professor Lemmens, for a wonderful analysis of the way the industry manipulates and skews the information. And while I agree with you with everything you said about the way the information is being treated and processed by the industry, I'm slightly less optimistic about the legal solutions. And that is not because I don't think we have good legal solutions in our toolkit. It's just because, as you suggested yourself, I think we have a problem, and Professor Adrian suggested himself too, that we have a problem of industry capture, maybe some would say legislator capture, and the industry is extremely strong. So I'm usually not a proponent for technological fixes. I'm very critical of them, but I think we might have one solution in our toolkit that is just emerging now, which is the employment of biosensors. And before Ian Kerr and Michael Gus jump at me, I would say that these biosensors have to be strictly, completely not having wireless connectivity for privacy reasons. But I think that biosensors can unleash tons of new information that we haven't seen that is vital to assess the information in the post-clinical context. And what I would also suggest possibly that if the system works, and of course we need laws to govern these biosensor distribution, the privacy aspect, lack of connectivity, and so forth. But if we go with such a solution of unleashing the post-clinical information through biosensors, I think that this could also provide deterrence, even in the clinical, even with clinical information. Because if we have a good post-marketing pharmacovigilance system, then eventually companies would have less incentive to develop new pharmaceuticals that they know about their risk profile. So I would like your opinion about this idea.
Yeah, so I agree. Actually, it connects a little bit with the comments Amir made about the importance of post-market surveillance and pharmacovigilance. So I didn't talk about it because I actually wanted to particularly make the claim that the traditional emphasis on market entry data has kind of skewed the way we think about clinical trials evidence. So I didn't discuss, which I've discussed actually in other publications, yes, how post-market surveillance has improved, but needs further improvement. It certainly will do a lot, but you have to keep in mind that there's actually also a lot of pressure on the system, particularly in the context of new drug development related to niche market drugs, orphan drugs, pharmacogenomic drugs, and so on, to actually allow pharmaceutical products to enter the market more quickly. Pressures that or arguments that are being invoked there are that these often deal with life-threatening diseases, so we need access to these drugs faster. Also, that it's harder to conduct large clinical trials because we're dealing with small markets, and so you get these drugs on the market before you actually gather the necessary pharmacovigilance data. It takes time. So you say, the more we develop that system, the less likely pharmaceutical companies will have incentives to get the drugs out there. The profits generated by 1 year of sales of blockbuster or even now niche buster drugs can go up to $7-8 billion. And so even if there are hints or presumptions that there may be some problems with drugs, if you get a drug on the market for one particular year, even if pharmacovigilance starts showing at one point that there are problems with the drug, the profits will have been made. So the incentive of pharmacovigilance to be more careful about what drugs get on the market, I think, doesn't necessarily work. Another issue I would also say, the move towards getting drugs on the market faster with increased pharmacovigilance also creates difficulties from a public policy perspective, because once drugs are on the market, even if there are significant side effects, drug regulators get a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism when they decide to pull a drug from the market. And there I would want to give the example of Vikes, for example, also to show you that it's not just for psychiatric drugs. I did select psychiatric drugs here in my examples, but I actually had a lot of others that I deleted that I couldn't discuss. Vikes is one of them. So this is not psychiatric drugs. It was entered into the market. There are allegations that the company actually knew or should have known about some of the safety issues. The drug was on the market. It led to 10,000 or more premature deaths or heart attacks and strokes. So drugs are on the market. Even when Vioxx was pulled from the market, some people were saying, I really need this drug. So you drug regulators are taking away from me a drug that really helped me. So I don't know whether that claim is accurate or not, or whether that's appropriate or not. But once a drug is on the market, people resist the idea that what they think is really helping them and saving them will be pulled from the market. So it's not an easy decision to just say, oh, we'll have more pharmacovigilance and then and then gather information, pull the drug from the market. There are all kinds of incentives that lead often to keeping drugs on the market that are actually not necessarily safe.
Second and last.
Jeremy DeVere, University of Ottawa. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like your comments on the relationship between these issues and the emergence of proprietary rights in respect of this data. Starting with the TRIPS agreement and recently expanded significantly through the Canada-EU CETA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how these issues have emerged from really a health and safety issue to one of economic and commercial significance, and the issue of intellectual property rights in these data.
Yeah, so I couldn't discuss this in detail, but I don't have this is one thing I'm currently analyzing, working on, which is actually looking at the way in which the new transatlantic partnership agreement may impact on clinical trials data sharing. It's actually unclear. What is clear, though, obviously we don't have information yet about the details of the agreement, which is quite troubling. But when you look at some of the documents which I received from colleagues who have been working on this as well, and actually civil society organizations who are looking at this, so they obtained, through access to information legislation in the United States, documents that were submitted in the context of the trade negotiations. And you see there that industry was very, very hard pushing to have a very wide recognition of commercial secrecy. And so here you have a statement made to the chief negotiator for the United States. Pharma submitted to Douglas Bell, chair of the Trade Policy Staff Committee in 2013, a document where they say, we're really worried about these disclosure policies in Europe. So you, in your trade negotiations, you have to emphasize that this impacts on our trade interests and hinders innovation, which is always the easy argument to be made. And so, will that have an impact on what EMA, the European Medicines Agency, is doing? It's not clear. In the presentation, so I had some slides which I couldn't get into discuss in detail. I've actually looked at some some of the cases that went to the European Court of Justice, where you see that the European Court of Justice sided actually with the concept of transparency, but where the European Medicines Agency, after winning in court, basically caved into industry demands for secrecy, which I think is extremely troubling. So here you have a European court and an interim decision, it was not a full decision, embracing or certainly taking distance from this right to privacy claim of industry, saying, "Well, wait a minute, this is not that obvious." So basically allowing the European Medicines Agency to disclose data, but you see the agency completely caving in and basically limiting data access, which I think could be related to this, that there is international pressure, that there is pressure from the European Union by the European Trade Commission to limit data access because of these concerns. So I think it's a problem that we have to fight, and that's also why I think a human rights discourse may help to make the claim basically that this is so essential that we have to create a space for transparency.
On that note, we're out of town. Before I thank the speaker, two quick announcements. First, for what it's worth, I wanted to apologize again for the tech difficulties and also mention that we did review the literature on the efficacy of the AV system in the room. So anyway, it's not just the pharma industry that has those problems. And I also wanted to mention that for any of you who is a first year in the room, the Center for Law, Technology, and Society runs the Technoship program. The Center for Health Law, Policy, and Ethics runs the Santéship program, which is a wonderful way for you to get involved in the cutting-edge research that is going on both in the health law and the law and technology fields. And without further ado, on behalf of both centers, I would like to sincerely thank you, Professor Lemmens, for speaking to us about this really interesting issue, and also Professor Adarand for your comments on it. So thank you very, very much, and thank you for coming.